My biggest concern now is that we're going to restart this economy without regard to environmental degradation. One point after the crisis started, the COVID crisis, we had cut emissions by something like 50% by getting rid of what they called non-essentials. Why are we bringing back non-essentials that are going to create what may be the largest problem we have? Look at all the money they're talking about that we needed to, all the Green New Deal and everything that was going to drop emissions by 30 or 40%. We just dropped 50% just on conservation. That's more than we could have bought, in real terms or nominal terms ever, for the next 30 years. We got it all at once in like a weekend, right? And we're just squandering it.
One of the old arguments is if you want to get rid of environmentally damaging things, people say, what about the jobs? So that's why you really need a job guarantee, the transition, because you take that out of the equation. It's like you can't get rid of hanging. What's going to happen to the poor old hangman?
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. For as little as $1 a month, you can get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. A big thank you to all our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard MMT founder Warren Mosler and author Dr. Phil Armstrong, and in a moment we're going to be talking to them about their recent paper on the Weimar Republic Hyperinflation, and also we talk about how understanding modern money gives us some real solutions for today's urgent crises. This is part 2 of a 2-part interview, so check out our last episode, that's episode 88, to get the full context of this episode. And also, if you're new to MMT, you might want to listen to our first 3 episodes for an explanation of the basics. In this episode, we're talking about hyperinflation, but first let's talk about inflation. And let's start with the insight that currency issuing governments like those of, say, the UK, the US, Japan, Canada, or Australia create new money when they spend instead of recycling tax money collected previously. It has to be that way since these governments, through their agents, are the sole issuers of their respective currencies. And the sole issuer of anything has to issue that thing before anybody else can have any quantity of it in their possession. So the government necessarily has to spend first before anybody in the non-government, that would include you and me, can have any currency to pay taxes with in the first place. This can be quite jarring when you first hear it, but tax payments aren't the source of revenue for government spending. Taxation instead serves to create a permanent demand for the government's money. To paraphrase economist Hyman Minsky, anybody can create money. The trick is to get it accepted. And when you're a national government, demanding taxes be paid in the currency that you alone are allowed to issue is the way you accomplish that trick. So without taxation, the need to acquire the currency goes away and it loses its value. Given that governments can and do spend money into existence every day without operational limit, in other words, their spending is not revenue constrained, the question then becomes, what is the limit to government spending? What would be the evidence of too much spending power in an economy? As Professor Stephanie Kelton explains in The Deficit Myth, excessive spending manifests as inflation. So evidence of government overspending could be inflation. It's not the only cause of inflation, but we'll put that to one side. But the consequence of a government underspending is that there will be people in the economy looking for a way to earn currency to pay their taxes with who can't yet find it, otherwise known as unemployment. Given that inflation costs politicians their jobs and unemployment generally doesn't, when they form a government, politicians tend to favour the underspending option and then they dodge their responsibility for the consequences by blaming the victims. But when you understand where money comes from, you understand it's absolutely on them, the monopoly issuer of the currency, if the demand for the thing they issue is not met. Over the last couple of decades, MMT economists have developed a policy approach that, if adopted, would ensure that governments automatically spend precisely where and when it's needed to create true full employment without inflation. The proposal has a number of names. I'm going to call it the job guarantee. Warren often calls it the transition job. But in the show notes, I've linked to our episode 47 with job guarantee expert Professor Pavlina Chernova explaining it in more detail. And I've also linked to a list of people and movements advocating for it. Most excitingly this week, US Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley has introduced a congressional resolution recognizing the duty of the federal government to create a job guarantee. So I've linked to where people can put their weight behind and learn from that initiative and others like it. Of course, wherever you are in the world, a good place to start is by ignoring any economist who depicts a government that creates its own money, like it's in the position of an adult film star needing to come to some arrangement with a plutocrat to get funding. Speaking of things that suck, what about hyperinflation? Perhaps a large source of misunderstanding about hyperinflation comes from the term itself. In the words of author Clint Ballinger, quote, calling a currency collapse hyperinflation is like calling a plane crash a hyperlanding, end quote. In episodes of what gets called hyperinflation, it's never the case that too much money gets created and that causes it to become worthless. It's the other way around. The sharp currency depreciation comes first and the rapid acceleration in money creation comes second to keep up with the demand for money in the domestic economy. And in these extreme instances, we need to go case by case to determine the cause of the original depreciation. Opponents of certain categories of government spending have, as Michael Hudson wrote in 2013, quote, implanted a false memory and a false economic theory blaming hyperinflation on deficit spending. The reality is that every hyperinflation in history has come from paying foreign debts, not domestic debts. Germany's Weimar inflation resulted from the Reichsbank having to pay reparations to the Allied powers. It sold German currency on the foreign exchange markets for sterling, francs, and dollars, far beyond Germany's ability to obtain foreign exchange by exporting. Germany had been stripped of its coal and steel production capacity, and its ability to export was limited. So the currency plunged. Declining exchange rates caused import prices to rise. The general price level followed suit behind the umbrella effect of higher import prices. More money had to be printed to pay for transactions purposes at the higher price level. Every serious study of the German hyperinflation shows the same sequence of causation, from foreign debt payment to currency depreciation, rising domestic prices, and finally to new money creation. Our guests this week, Warren and Phil, with their paper, have applied to this the MMT recognition that fiat currency is a public monopoly, and that monopolists are necessarily price setters rather than price takers, and therefore the price level is a function of prices paid by government when it spends. Towards the end of the interview, you'll hear Warren advocate for Medicare for all, but you'll also hear him saying that implementing it would be a deflationary event. And I think that goes to the heart of MMT's relevance for today. The conventional view might be that if the government's going to increase its spending to ensure that every American gets healthcare free at the point of delivery, the taxes will need to go up to quote-unquote pay for that increase in spending. But when you consider that tax revenues aren't the source of funding for federal government spending, and that raising taxes reduces overall spending power in the economy, and that as people switch from private healthcare to Medicare for all, a large part of the for-profit medical insurance industry will become redundant, an understanding of how modern money actually works should make it clear that the rational response to a deflationary event like this would be not to take more spending power out of the economy by raising taxes, but to go in the other direction, either lower taxes or increase spending in other areas, or both, depending on your politics. So rather than economic shocks having to be a bad thing, they can be an opportunity for the government to take up that newly created slack, at least by guaranteeing a minimum standard of living through a job guarantee while the private sector reorganizes itself, or something more ambitious like a green infrastructure project. But the point is, understanding how the system works gives you all the options. So I hope you'll get time to check out the show notes for this episode, where I've linked to some useful resources relating to all of the above, and as ever, to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT podcast. Support starts at $1 a month, which is 71 British pence at the time of recording. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes where you can ask me and Patricia MMT questions. We are 100% listener supported. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in.
Looking at this, the history is really interesting, obviously knowing what happened afterwards as a result of this crisis. But it seems that Germany was in a very difficult conundrum in the sense that people were advising the German politicians to stop printing money. But this German guy that you quote quite a lot, I don't want to say his name because I'll probably butcher it. He mentioned that if Germany stopped printing money effectively, the whole thing, the whole economy would collapse.
Yeah, that's Heffleric.
Yeah, nobody could buy a newspaper or make change,
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other thing was that, Germany needed basically to increase exports in order to attain the foreign exchange that it needed to pay these reparations. But at the same time, it had to reduce demand at home, which meant creating unemployment. And to me, that there is a bit of a contradiction there, because how do you get the thriving economy that you need to increase exports and be productive, while at the same time undermine your economy to, and make people poorer?
So what they were required to do, and I think it was in the paper there, one of the economists got it right, saying they'd have to have full employment but reduce consumption.
Mm-hmm. Basically wartime conditions.
Yeah, and they know how to do that, but they didn't want to do it because it would have been, some kind of revolution or something. The social society would have turned over. They were concerned about reducing the real standard of living further from where it was. It was already very low, which was Keynes' point,
There's a theoretical mechanism, I think, where, say, for example, you raise taxes by a given percent, say 20%, you destroy the domestic population's ability to consume those 20% of products there were. If you give that money to a foreign power, then they can then buy that 20%, can't they? Net. But it requires, so the taxes are making your domestic population poorer. So therefore, what they were buying is now freed up in principle for the Germans to give that money they've collected in tax. That will then go to the agent general. They can swap it for sort of American dollars to pay off America. And then if you imagine then, you've now got that huge chunk of products being waiting to be bought by the guys who've bought the German currency. So that all works a treat, assuming that you can reduce the buying power of the German population by 20%. Well, bearing in mind they're all incredibly poor. The Allies have taken all their rolling stock. They've hardly got any ships. And then when, of course, the French occupied the Ruhr, nearly all their coal, how can they make all this stuff? So you're saying to the Germans, who are already pretty much on starvation, you've got to reduce your real consumption by 20%. It's a non-starter. So as Warren said, the tempting thing is not to raise your taxes. So leave the Germans with the same money they had already and just give the Allies the paper marks, and that just drives the currency down. And it was made incredibly much worse when the Allies invaded the Ruhr, because now you got even less production. The Germans kept on printing paper money to pay the workers, if you like. So if you like, they're paying this currently or even higher prices, competing for higher prices. So that's the chain of events. So it could work. That's the mechanism, but it could only work if the country you're trying to exact the real stuff from, politically and economically, is powerful enough, to make those reparations. And now, obviously, Keynes reckoned they weren't. People have said they weren't. I agree with Keynes. I don't think the Germans could ever make those payments, politically or economically.
If you look at Germany today, they're a big net exporter. So the exact same thing is happening. That's coming out of their consumption, okay? But
they're doing it voluntarily, Warren.
They're doing it voluntarily, and they think they're winning. And it's much and the exports are much higher than was ever required out of the Weimar.
Yeah.
But the Weimar story reminds me more of Greece in this instance for some reason.
I always said about Greece, they early on in the crisis, they're complaining that the Greeks are lazy and they don't want to work. And that's been the problem. And they've got all this debt. And so what do you do to somebody who's lazy and doesn't want to work? You throw them out of work, raise unemployment. No. What sense does that make?
Yeah.
So it's like even on their own terms, their policies, they're even worse on their own terms. I mean, they were bad enough in real terms, but what they did is terrible.
Yeah. It's a bit like when you got a naughty kid at school, and he doesn't like coming to school, so you punish him by excluding him for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
I mean, not a really good plan, that.
So I was just going to say we could just sort of turn the corner now. When people talk about money creation inevitably leads to runaway inflation, they cite Weimar Germany, but then they don't take it that one step further, as in Germany's still there, is doing okay, and now they don't have hyperinflation. Something must have happened. And people don't get curious as to what. And we've talked a little bit around it. So what is it that actually happened?
Well, basically, Schatz got rid of the circumstances that, if you like, made it necessary for cause that whole chain of events. From that point, the change of policy.
They stopped paying the higher prices for foreign exchange. In fact, people were speculating against
regulating credit.
What's that?
The first step was regulating credit.
Yeah. And then what happened was in the foreign exchange markets, somebody was betting against the German government being able to do it, constrain their prices. But Schatz did, and it created a huge short squeeze in their favor.
So expectations were wrong, basically.
Yeah. The expectation thing didn't hold up that one last time.
Well, if you imagine all these guys with all this dodgy money, this emergency money.
This emergency money that we've been talking about, was it literally anybody could print money? I mean, what?
I think they had to have some form of licensing,
right.
But there was a lot. I mean, I can't remember the numbers. I don't know whether, if it was you could just ring up on one of those little phones. So there would have been some form of licensing. Yeah. So I think that for humour, anybody, and it might have been quite close. But it wasn't literally anybody. There were licensed printers. And there was a lot of them.
Yeah.
So all this emergency money, what Schatz said is it's not worth anything anymore. Now, if you imagine he wasn't a popular guy, and he also stopped the Reichsbank's credit, where you could swap this note geld for Reichs money. And basically, he became very, very unpopular with industrialists. And there was the major industrialist in Germany, and I can't remember his name now. It'll come to me. It's in the paper. He was like the Rupert Murdoch figure or more. He was like he had a massive argument with him. Because basically he stopped the system at source. So there was a limit on what the Germans were prepared to pay for foreign currency. They got a moratorium, so they didn't have to keep buying it anyway. And then they just stopped the policy. And as Warren was noting before, it just stopped. To answer your question, they just stopped it at source. So people couldn't borrow money at random to speculate on. In fact, a lot of them had borrowed Reichsmarks to speculate in dollars. And then the whole system was blocked and they all took big losses. And a lot of people ended up having to sell dollars back to the Reichsbank and take a loss. So basically, he's a tough guy, and he put, if you like, a block on the system.
Could we just talk about that mechanism by which speculators can drive down the value of a currency? In this case, it was driving the value of the mark down against the dollar. Because I guess that's still something that speculators are able to do today. They
sell it in the forward market, and the forward market trades at a premium or discount depending on implied interest rates, of course. And in this case, there were large discounts in the forward market. They were selling anyway after several years of profiting from that. And all of a sudden, those discounts disappeared and their forward prices came up to spot prices.
Just thinking about people who don't know what the forward market is it basically just a futures contract, somebody making a contract with another party about buying something, say 3 months or 6 months from now?
Right. So I might make a contract with you or with a bank to sell marks at a price, and I'm going to deliver them in December.
Mm-hmm. And you only put a deposit for that. You don't pay the full price.
Yes. But then when December comes, I've got to deliver those marks. So I've got to be able to buy them in the market. So I'm betting that the price of the market is going to drop. And if it doesn't, and I have to pay extra for them, then I lose. And that's what happened.
My understanding is they were making these contracts with borrowed money or counting on being able to get the borrowed money. And when that didn't materialize because of the regulations that the government had introduced, they had to sell them. And the only party that was buying them was the government at a price that it had set. So they had to take the price of the government.
Yeah, they were making leverage bets for sure. And the credit for leverage bets had always been there, and suddenly it wasn't there. And suddenly the foreign exchange the mark was not dropping, the spot price held, interest rates were way down, and forward prices went up instead of down. But again, I didn't look into all the details of that. There were a couple of stories we quoted in the paper with references to where you can read all the details.
I think Heflerick gives the exact details of what he did. There's a long quote about how he forced by preventing people getting credit to pay for their contracts to buy the dollars. So they had the dollars, but they couldn't pay the bill back to get the marks to pay them. So the only way they get that was to sell them at the rate that the Reichsbank offered. So they were scuppered, basically. They ended up making a loss. In the paper, there's a quote from Heflerick, and he gives you the exact figure. I think it was something like 4.5 billion marks at one point, and people thought it would go higher, and they ended up paying more for it, but they couldn't get the marks set.
That was the exchange. 4.5 billion marks to a dollar.
And then they changed when they came to the Reichsmark, when they bought the Rentenmark in, just to make it easy, they made it equal to, I think, 1 billion, if my memory serves me right, without the paper. They made it what was 4.5 billion paper marks became 4.5 Reichsmarks. And that was the rate they fixed at.
Yeah. It's 4.2 billion.
Well, I wasn't too bad for an old man. I was point 3 out. I'll take that. So the quote gives you the figures that people tried. They thought that it would go like to 12 or something like that, but they didn't, and they couldn't get the money to pay for it, so they had to sell the dollars back. See,
he realized that the marks to buy the dollars came from the central bank, and so he was in a position of setting the price of those in the exchange market, and he fixed the exchange, right, Phil? And said, you just can't get them for any rate other than that. And they bet against him and wound up losing the bet. Again, it's the idea that he recognized it as a monopoly that it was, and he's price setter, and there's nothing they could do except bet against him and take losses, which they did. It's like if the Fed says we're going to have zero rates and you want to bet that rates are going to go higher, you can place all the bets you want, but you're going to lose unless they decide rates are going higher. It was a similar type of thing, only in a different market.
Yeah, they took on the Reichsbank, and previously I think they might have won, but Schacht wasn't giving ground. He kind of was quite single-minded. He just sat in a room, as I said, made a lot of phone calls, and he wouldn't give in. Now, don't get the idea that he wasn't under massive pressure to give in. A lot of people said, you're destroying the economy, you've got to let us operate, you've got to let us do what we want to do, the economy will grind to a halt. And when Schacht did it, there was a lot of pain, Not as much pain as there would have been without but don't get the idea there was no pain, because they did suffer pain. And in the paper you talk about, the very high unemployment that happened.
In the paper you write,
yeah.
However, it must be noted that this quote-unquote success did come at a high real cost, as unemployment increased significantly. And in the paper you also suggest how this economic hard landing could have been softened. Could you tell us about that?
So if you look around the world, there are plenty of countries that have high unemployment and high inflation. So the point is, the inflation is caused by different things and not just aggregate demand. It's again, prices paid by government, and it can be stabilized or brought down, whatever you want to do with it, without that kind of a real cost to the economy. But it's not something that they did. So
what we're really saying, I think, in this paper is what Schacht did basically was kind of harsher than it needed to be, in the sense that if they just set a price limit at a certain level, he overshot what he was supposed to do. If you just say, right, okay, we will buy everything, but it's going to be at a certain price level. You know, we won't go above a certain level. You wouldn't have had to have such an aggregate demand reduction. So instead of saying, right, okay, we want to get rid of this inflation by crashing all the demand, we're going to buy stuff, but at a lower price. How that would translate in practice, obviously, you would have to instruct the agent general, for a start off, that it shouldn't buy the money that it needs to buy in order to pay the allies at a price on the exchanges above a certain level.
Right,
now,
which I believe they did.
They did in the end.
Yeah.
But you have to persuade, in a sense, the agent general that that's in their own interest. Because obviously they'd be thinking, no, we've got some paper marks. What we're going to do is get the dollars we need or the pounds we need by selling them to meet the reparations demands. But that might necessarily, if they just pay any old price, you're going to start the thing again, aren't you, by, you know, driving down the value of the mark. So if you say, yeah, we'll buy it, but only at this price. So that's the question, really. You could have, by being more aware of just setting a price that you're going to spend, you could have reduced the inflation, got rid of the inflation perhaps a little more easily than crashing aggregate demand to the extent they did. So basically the figures are given in note 12, I think. 1922 unemployment was 213,000. Then after the inflation, it was gone up to 636,000. So it's quite a hard landing, you know. So Schacht was tough. You know, he prevented access to credit, and he had to be a hard man. But in crashing the system, he maybe crashed it a bit too hard. Now, obviously, I'm not a Weimar historian, and in a way, I hope that, you know, if Dirk and there's another young scholar from Australia called Matt Crocker, very sharp guy, he's getting involved in that. I hope these guys are going to look at the original German and really get down to the politics a bit, you know, because what we're talking in a way, broad sweep about the mechanisms. So this isn't the end of the story, I think. It's the beginning. It's a bit of an analogy, really, when Copernicus found that the sun was at the middle, not the earth. It wasn't the end of astronomy, was it? It was the beginning of a new form of astronomy. So what I'm saying is this paper, we hope, is the beginning of an MMT-informed analysis of Weimar. And it's going to take, hopefully, Dirk and his work, people who German speakers can really dig into the detail. You know, could Schacht have done any better? I mean, theoretically, yeah.
My point was to tell the story from a perspective of the price level being a function of prices paid by government, and show how that narrative, you know, fits in with all the factual information that we had. Beyond that, I didn't have a particular purpose in telling the story. That was the whole thing. And how the interest rates, you know, entered into it. Interest rates made it worse, that type of thing. So, you know, again, it was just to look at it from my perspective of how a monopoly functions.
Just on that topic, Warren, we had one of our patrons, her name's Victoria, ask us a question, and she says she thinks she might be paraphrasing, but the way it landed with her, and this is her listening to the last time we did a Q&A with you, that she thought that you were saying that the interest rate, so the Bank of England base rate in the UK or the Fed funds rate in the US, is equal to the academic rate of inflation. First of all, is that what you're saying, Warren?
Yeah, well, I don't know if equal is a word, but it is the rate of inflation as academically defined. That is what they're defining. Academically, if you say what is the academic rate of inflation, I would say it's the term structure of forward prices faced by agents in the economy. That's how I see the academic definition of inflation. And it's a real thing. If you're anybody in the economy looking to buy a house for delivery next year, the price of that house is going to be different than if you were, you know, because of the interest rate. It's going to affect the cost of building that house, the cost of money involved during that year of construction, and it's going to have a direct effect on the price of that house for delivery 1 year from now. So it's real prices faced by real people in the economy, and it's the term structure of those prices, not just the prices for delivery today or tomorrow, but delivery for a year forward, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years.
Great. So then she goes on to note that the Fed raised its policy rate 8 times over 3 years from December 2015, despite not meeting their inflation target. And she said, I'm presuming Warren's definition of academic inflation doesn't equal what the Fed consider as their inflation target. So the equivalent in the UK being CPI.
That's correct.
Yeah.
But, I would say that the rate of inflation as academically defined went up when the Fed raised rates. And interestingly enough, the actual way they measured inflation went up when they raised rates. And then when they brought rates down, it came down again. Now, I can't tell you where that exact causation is, but, part of it, a small part maybe, is the interest expenditures.
I looked it up actually. The Bank of England say their website, the CPI is a measure of inflation they use. The Fed uses PCE, price index, personal consumption expenditure, which has a slightly different basket of goods and different ways of imputing housing and healthcare costs.
But it tells you what happened in the last period to prices.
Yeah.
And then the next period is a forecast. So they don't actually have a rate of inflation.
Yeah, right.
They just tell you what it was last month. The Fed just reported January's increase, for example. And the Bank of England probably did the same, but they don't know, like right now, what's the rate of increase. If you ask them right now, what is it? They don't report that. If you said, like, right now, what's the rate that prices are increasing? They can't answer that question. They can tell you what happened last month, and they can give you a forecast of what they think will happen next month, but that's all it is.
So she rounds off the question just by asking, what metric or academic rate of inflation do we expect to rise in conjunction with the central bank rate?
No, that's just what the economy is facing today. It doesn't tell you what prices will be in the future or the past, unless you want to forecast that. But that's not what inflation's about. Inflation's about how does it affect decisions by economic agents? How does it change your life facing this term structure of prices that's increasing at 0 or increasing at 5% or increasing at 10%? How does that change your economic life? So this tells you that the term structure you're facing that somehow changes your life is a direct function of the policy rate.
Would we expect to see that in their rearview mirror when they give their reports?
Yes, maybe. Now, what we can learn from our UMKC Buckaroo model or the Franklin Frank or the Denison dollar is that a permanent zero rate policy is just fine. It's not inflationary. It's not anything. And there were no government securities. Just they spent the buckaroos and just let people hold them. They didn't sell securities to take them out of circulation or anything like that. They just left them out there. And it's certainly not inflationary. And Japan's demonstrated the same thing for 30 years. The Bank of Japan's pretty much bought all the JGBs, the bonds. So what's outstanding are just the yen that was spent by the government that haven't been used to pay taxes. And there's certainly no inflation problem or currency depreciation problem or anything like that in Japan. So the first lesson is just set rates at 0 and leave them there. They're not a policy tool to fight inflation or not fight inflation the way you've been presuming. Just leave them alone. The volatility does a lot more damage than any good that you might get from what your models tell you is supposed to happen if you change them, because it doesn't happen. So there's absolutely no reason to not leave rates at 0 that I can see. And then if your economy's not strong enough, use fiscal adjustments. And the answer there is, well, you don't want to rely on politicians. We'd rather rely on central bankers. Well, maybe you would, but the interest rate doesn't do anything anyway. So you don't have any choice. That's my point. Where's your choice?
So what does the MMT view of price level and interest rates mean for policy today? In that, are there cases in the US or the UK where government is paying continuously higher prices in an unhealthy way?
Yeah, that's not true.
There's some commentary out there in the economics blogosphere that you need to have a government sell securities in order to maintain a 0 interest rate.
Yeah, no.
That's my take too. I just wanted to hear it from you.
No. Look, we've got 3 universities with permanent 0 rates with no government securities. You can go in and audit them anytime you want.
You might have to sell securities to maintain a rate above that, possibly. It's one of the ways of doing it.
Yeah, if you want to support the term structure rates at something higher, well, then that's called selling securities.
So they just got it the wrong way around. I mean, it's almost as if to see the world in reverse. they get pretty much everything the wrong way around. It's almost as if they've worked something out and deliberately put it the wrong way around.
I always think that about the MMT lens, is that, it shows the mainstream. It's not a bit wrong or needs a bit of modification. It is exactly 180 degrees in the wrong direction.
I know, so much of it is, yeah.
So if you guys, I'll ask each of you, if you were in charge of the UK economy or the US economy today, would you have an inflation target?
Yeah, I'd start with zero, and I'd have permanent zero rate policy and a job guarantee to transition unemployed more readily to the private sector for better, superior price anchor and to help transition people to the private sector. I'd eliminate savings incentives because, they got this other thing backwards about how you need savings to have money for investment. So get rid of all these savings incentives. Yeah, and on the trade deficit, I'd get rid of all the tariffs, except if you need things for strategic purpose, that's different. But for just general consumer purposes, I would have no restrictions on imports. I'd have in the U.S. go to a real public health system, Medicare for all at no charge, which is also a big deflationary event for the U.S. So for trade, free trade, no tariffs for consumer purposes, but for strategic purposes, you might want to produce things domestically. Maybe the military should source its own steel domestically, things like that. You might want to source some critical drugs domestically for security reasons. But apart from that, free trade to keep prices down. Public education should be free. It's an investment for the community. It's not an expense for the student. It's part of, the community's infrastructures to have educated people. I look at it as a benefit that serves public purpose. I don't know. I've got a whole list of other things. I showed you my stock market proposal. Get rid of that casino. Reasonable retirement, Social Security for seniors. There's no moral hazard in that. My biggest concern now is that we're going to restart this economy without regard to environmental degradation. It's like, what's that all about? At one point after the crisis started, the COVID crisis, we had cut emissions by something like 50%, just purely through conservation, right? And by getting rid of what they called, non-essentials. Okay, they're non-essential. So if we can cut emissions 50% by getting rid of non-essentials, is anybody paying attention here? Why are we bringing back non-essentials that are going to create what may be the largest problem we have? What sense does that make? Why don't we bring back the economy without bringing back non-essentials that create environmental degradation? They're essential for jobs? No. You can have jobs doing things that are not, environmentally degradative, if there is such a word.
Sounds a good one. I'd
you like that one? There's no thought being given to it. We're going to have a 1.9 trillion program. Well, why? Because people need the money. Well, what are they going to do with it? Well, they're going to go out and drive more. Well, do we want people driving more? Now, I don't mind people having the money and being able to eat and being able to pay for their bills and everything else, but do we want to do things to encourage more driving or more air conditioning or more heating? I don't think so. And so isn't this like an opportunity to bring these things back in, I'll call it a socially responsible manner or, a collectively responsible manner where you're looking at the collective and not just the individual? Sure it is. But I don't see anything like that coming out of Washington, probably not the UK either.
One of the old arguments is that if you kind of want to get rid of environmentally damaging things, people say, what about the jobs? So that's why you really need a job guarantee, the transition, because you take that out of the equation. I think, it's like you can't get rid of hanging. What's going to happen to the poor old hangman? And it's a bit we can't get rid of fox hunting, because, well, what about the poor old master of foxhounds? All this stuff. You have to decide what are morally reprehensible jobs or ones that damage the environment. If you got a job guarantee and people's incomes are guaranteed at a good level, then there's no problem. But obviously big business don't want that because they can use that, can't they? Say, well, we need us to, all right, we might dig up the earth and destroy everything, but what about the jobs? So the job guarantee in that way obviously is an inflation anchor, but it's crucial to counter that argument of what about the jobs? And in Britain, we get that. I mean, I'm sure you get in the US all the time. It doesn't matter how bad the jobs are. Well, we got to have them because where we're going to go. And obviously,
well, look, if you properly provision your national health system, how many jobs is that? It's probably more jobs than there are people.
yeah, we'll need a lot of people from the US coming over to help us, Warren.
Exactly. So that answers your unemployment problem right there.
Yeah.
That's just one agency.
Yeah.
So, but nobody's talking about it from that point of view. When you see these proposals for COVID relief, nobody's talking about, okay, let's make sure we steer them into, things that aren't, don't promote degradation. And so they are promoting degradation. And all these things that, all the things that were causing it are all coming back. What's that all about? Look at all the money they're talking about that we needed to, all the Green New Deal and everything that was going to drop emissions by 30 or 40% and cost vast amounts of money. Not that the money's the issue, but vast amounts of real resources. We just dropped 50% just on conservation. That's more than we could have bought, in real terms or nominal terms ever, for the next 30 years. We got it all at once in like a weekend, right? And we're just squandering it instead of bringing it back without, restoring the damaging aspects. So we can do it all through conservation, which costs nothing. And we're not doing any of it through conservation. We're doing it all. We're not doing anything, actually. So that, to me, that's the most disturbing part of the economy right now. That's my first thing I would address. These other things are nice, but
yeah, I think it should just be right. Unemployment's high. You can't find a job. Right. Bang. You're in the health service.
You can't build a computer that burns more than 5 watts of power, a laptop. Sorry. It's easy to regulate this stuff. You don't have to have 25-watt computers to handle all the advertising. How about no advertising on the internet? How much energy would that save?
As an engineer, I've been in the building industry for quite some time, and over here, the government has this policy that if they put too many, green restrictions on the way that we build houses, they're not going to build houses. So, they've been battling against more environmental regulation about the energy use, about the materials that they use, and it's a complete reliance on we don't want to spook the market.
Phil, is there anything you want to add?
I agree with what Warren said. I think if you had a job guarantee, you could obviously, your initial target for inflation, for your original question, which was a long time ago, the target would eventually be zero. You might get a little bit of inflation, or what might be, I don't want to go into what it is because I'll start another debate. You might get an odd price rise here, an odd price there. But I think that you would be, very small levels of inflation aren't proved to be disastrous. That my view of MMT with the job guarantee as a price anchor is much more efficient than monetary policy that A, doesn't do very much, and B, if it does anything, it works in reverse. So you're getting rid of something that works in reverse with something else, a job guarantee. But I think the crucial thing for me is get your job guarantee in place for all the reasons that have been said, and then you will find as a very happy byproduct from that, you will get a naturally automatic stabilizer as a price anchor. And I think that's in a way where the hyperinflation, hyperventilators need to be dealt with. And that's in a way why Warren and I wrote the paper. And as I said, for the listeners out there, keep an eye on, I'm hoping that Dirk and his team of academics with Matt Crocker will develop that, look at some original data, enrich the history in it. And as Warren said, in a way, what we really try to do, using Warren's insights, is to really put that narrative across of the prices paid by the government, if you like, fundamentally the driver of the price level. We can use, in a way, we use the monetarists' own prime example against them. And isn't that a great thing? We've stolen their weapon and used it against them. And that's why really I drove that and if you like, co-opted into it. And so I would admit that my knowledge of Weimar going into the project was quite limited. I've learned a little bit about Havenstein and Heflerich and these guys, but I don't in any way profess to be a historian at all, or certainly of that period. But I think it does bring insights in the paper into the general dynamic of what causes hyperinflation. And it contradicts completely the monetarist narrative. It's a more subtle narrative. And obviously the money supply has a place, but it's not in the same place. Do you remember Morecambe and Wise when they had Andre Previn? You know, when they said you're playing all the right notes, but not necessarily in the right order. In a way, that's monetarism. They've got most of the right notes, but they ain't in the right order.
It seems to me that this is a paper about a nation grappling with the political implications of economic decisions, in a sense that they had to choose between unemployment and not being able to pay reparations. And as well as, at some point, I think it's Helfferich. He regrets that Germany is being advised to stop printing money, really, but he fears that would bring economic life to a standstill and basically the whole thing would collapse. But he then adds that actually, if they did that, it might show that the reparations were too much for Germany, and that might actually, end the root of the true evil.
Yeah, let me just say something quickly here. He understood the difference between liquidity and money supply. And so he was talking, they were talking about ending is like the liquidity provision rather than the net financial assets. I found that interesting. So it's the same thing in our banking system. We can have a problem where in the interbank market where you need the liquidity provision, which is totally different from deficit spending. It's something where you need to add credits and debits to keep people from being in violation of rules. And he clearly understood that difference, and I think that's what he was referring to. When in that paragraph. I like that paragraph a lot. It's worth reading carefully to just in that light, the difference between liquidity provision.
I love it because it shows that it wasn't like the mainstream says. It wasn't just a lot of foolish men going, "Oh, let's print some money today." No, it was
right. And it wasn't. The liquidity provision is not the thing causing inflation. I guess that's what I'm going to say.
Yeah.
He said, "Yeah, we can do this. It'll undermine the economy. It's not going to stop the inflation. So what's the point?" And they were saying, "Oh no, it would stop the inflation." He goes, "No, the economy will come to a standstill, but the inflation's still there." And he was right.
Well, what's quite interesting about the Helfferich's book, I mean, it's a huge tome. I mean, this book called Money, it's like 700 pages or something. It's got loads of data in it. I mean, Helfferich and Knapp, or the guy who wrote State Theory of Money and all these sort of German historical school guys. I mean, in a way, they were all sort of laughed at by the monetarists, like a bit like, that thing with, what's he called, Lucas laughing at Keynes before the crash. The thing is, the guys who were laughing are the ones who should have been laughed at. Helfferich and, the guys at the Reichsbank, I mean, there are a lot of problems. They did, I'm not saying they did perfect, but their economics was pretty good. It was the monetarist stuff. And there's a guy, I wrote a bit about it in the long-winded paper before Warren edited it. There's a guy called Ferguson, and he writes, and it's a brilliant, I can't remember the title of the book, it's like a bestseller about, and it's a brilliant study of what happened in the period. And he's a historian, he's very good. But what he looks at through the lens of, if only they knew about monetarism, they wouldn't have had the problems. So if you imagine the narrative paints everything the wrong way around, a bit typical of it, that the guys that should have been, I'm not saying heroes, I'm not saying they're perfect, but they were kind of laughed at, but they were actually more or less putting forward the right types of things. It's the sort of monetarist re-examination in the 60s, 70s, 80s when these books are written. They're the ones that are putting the wrong spin on it. So though, if you like, without too much history, a thing called the Methodenstreit, where the German historical school came against the Austrians with all their sort of deductive methodology. Basically, for me, the good guys lost, And when you look at, there's so much good stuff in these old books. Like, guys really understood banks and how things worked. Whereas now, it's all like little squiggles in the textbooks, which makes me laugh, when I read Warren's 2.5-page annihilation of John B. Taylor's Taylor Rule and all these squiggles, because they don't understand banks and how they actually work.
In the past, when you've been asked what do we need commercial banks for? Because people like to try and make the case for, they're just intermediaries and they're not adding any value. And when people ask you, like, what do they do well? I think I'm right in saying your answer's been that commercial banks can price risk.
Well, that's why they're private and not public. That's what equity does. They lend based on pricing their evaluation of risk. So if their cost of funds is 3% and they lend to you at 6%, they've priced that risk at 3% or whatever. But if you have a public bank, they don't have that. So how do they decide how to make a loan or not? If Republicans are in power and you've got a Trump sticker on your yard, you get a loan, right?
Speaking of that, one thing that I would like is to have a bank that would lend me money in the way that Germany's debt was later organized, where it was like a reflection of Germany's economy. So that when I'm earning high, I can pay more, and when I'm earning little, I pay nothing. Could I have that with a public bank?
Yeah, I guess you could, but you got to decide whether you want lending at all, state-sponsored lending. You want banking to make payments is okay, checking, savings accounts, whatever, transaction accounts. But do you want a lending facility, or do you want people to just buy out of income? Save until they have enough to spend it, or do you want them to be able to borrow? Or the person who sells it, do you want them to be able to finance it for the buyer over time? And if so, for what? What serves public purpose? To do it for home ownership, to do it for qualifying business, to lend against stocks and bonds so they can leverage? I don't think so. So some of the more obvious ones are banks should not be able to lend against financial assets. I don't see the public purpose. It just adds leverage. Yeah, and everything else and what we have today, the crazy stock market stuff. But that's all driven by legislation, right? That allows banks to accept financial assets as collateral. They don't have to do that. Clean sheet of paper, what would I allow a bank to do? Home loans, car loans, maybe. How long a car loan? 3 years, 5 years, 10? These are all political decisions based on how you want to allocate investment and allocate consumption and everything else. And they're not looked at that way. They become looked at as financial decisions as to whether a bank can make a profit doing it or not, or whether there's risk to the taxpayer if they default and that type of thing, rather than the public purpose they're serving on the expenditure side.
Just before we wrap up, we talked about this a little bit before we started recording, but there's some rumors going around that, well, not rumors, I haven't found the statement yet, but apparently an official Bank of England statement has said that they're asking banks to get ready for negative interest rates in about 6 months' time, or they might, or it's something they might do. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact information to hand, but you start to tell me, what their MMT view of negative interest rates are. It's
a wealth tax, a tax on bank deposits. You start off with £1,000. A year later, you have $999. It's just a tax, and taxes remove funds from the economy. They remove net financial assets. They create, a need to replace it if you had a savings desire. So, it's a deflationary event. It's not inflationary. They're doing it because they think it's inflationary to lower rates and make them negative. They've got it backwards. Not that Phil could believe they've got one more thing backwards, but they've got it backwards.
I can believe it.
And if they understood it was backwards, they would never do it. So all this policy is being driven by backwards thinking. This is just another example. If you had any doubts that they understood the monetary system, there's your evidence that they don't.
Okay, well, as soon as this podcast hits the internet, it's all going to change. So thanks, guys. We're going to link to the paper and to where people can get hold of all things Warren and Phil, including your books. So once again, thank you, Warren Mosler and Phil Armstrong, for joining us today on the MMT podcast.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks very much. See you later.
Cheers. So that was that. Now it's time for listener questions.
The first question is by Andrew Lloyd, and it's about imports and exports. So he says, I get that exports are a real cost and imports are a real benefit as a point of logic. However, even if we limit imports from exploitative producers, we could probably import virtually every consumable cheaper than the cost of producing it in the UK. Once we get to that point, what reason is there for people outside the UK to want to own pounds, as there would be very little to buy in pounds? Won't that affect the value of the pound in relation to other currencies?
Shall I just jump in there and just say, well, I don't think that the point about imports being a benefit and exports being a cost in real terms is about, so we should import everything and export nothing. That's not the point. Nobody's saying that. The point is just, as you say, Andrew, it's just a point of logic that not every single nation can be a net exporter. Not every single nation can be a net importer. Wherever there's a net exporter, there's got to be a net importer. So the point about the exports being a cost and imports being a benefit is, so somebody's got to be an importer if somebody else is going to be an exporter. In real terms, the importer is winning at trade because they're a net importer, but obviously they probably won't be able to get imports if they don't export anything. The purpose of the exports is to get the imports. The nation's real wealth is your pile of stuff, everything that you can produce domestically, hopefully at full employment, plus anything the rest of the world wants to send to you, minus what you have to send to the rest of the world. And here's the crucial bit, to get what they send to you. Even if we could import virtually every consumable cheaper than the cost of producing it in the UK, that's not the point of that point of logic about imports and exports. You know, nobody's trying to say, yes, we should just import everything.
I just want to add, there is the free trade treaties, right? I think it's important to draw a distinction, because when Warren has been on here a few times saying that he would drop tariffs to zero on everything except for those goods that are strategic to a country, strategic being the key word here. Apart from that, we have to draw a distinction between what is to kind of have a one-sided zero tariff policy, and also how that compares to current free trade treaties. Because current treaties, they are drawn on this idea, on the premise that the market is best left free from government intervention, and that therefore, you know, the competitiveness of each country should be based on just market forces. And so the problem with that is that they often include clauses that mean that governments cannot subsidize industries, for example, you know, to help make competition a bit fairer. And Andrew's point is it's very smart, because obviously in the UK people have a higher standard of living than in other nations, or they have higher wages than in other nations, and sometimes, you know, that can make your industry uncompetitive when it comes to another nations that pays that have more laxed workers' laws and therefore are able to pay workers less wages. So I think you have to consider the ethical as well as the kind of what Warren calls the strategic aspects of trade, which is that you want to be able to produce medicines in the country, for example. So you may want to protect certain industries. You
I think
want to
Warren
be able to have,
would call that strategic as well. I mean, medicine, that's kind of strategic as well. You know, if you're
that's what I mean.
Yeah, but yeah, in terms of like ethics, I'm pretty sure.
Or sustainability, you know, because like that. What about that trade deal that Europe did with Brazil just before the Brazilian fires for meat? So it was about exporting meat from Brazil. And a lot of this, as a result, a lot of the there were a lot of wildfires in the Amazon, and people trying to make more land for basically meat, for producing meat, and all that meat was not going to feed Brazilians; it was going to the export market. You know, there is an argument to say we shouldn't really make free trade deals or try to compete with nations that don't have the ethical standards with regards to sustainability, that don't have sustainability regulations that they should. To me, that's maybe strategic as well.
Okay, let's say you're a person in the UK and you don't like that we are supporting materially the Saudi campaign in Yemen.
Yeah. Okay,
so you put pressure on your government not to sell arms to Saudi Arabia if you're a person on the ground, an activist. And the conservative mindset friends that you might have will come back to you and go, yeah, but if we don't, we need the money. if we don't sell arms to, say, Saudi Arabia, then yes, it's barbaric, but we have to hold our noses and do it because we need the money. Well, MMT's got an answer for that. No, we don't need
exactly.
the money. And if somebody else wants to do it, I guess we can't stop them. But we can certainly have an ethical foreign policy if the only thing standing in the way of that ethical foreign policy is this argument, we need the money. So, I think MMT's got a lot to help people who want a moral, ethical foreign policy. Andrew sort of caps off the question by saying, I'm struggling with the potential real-world impact versus the point of logic of this bit of MMT. I think what I just described is a real-world thing. There are campaigners out there trying to campaign against the arms trade or trying to pressure their governments not to support foreign intervention or arms exports. And they are met with this, well, it's about the money. And the MMT-informed activists can go, okay, well, about the money. Let's talk about it. Yeah. We don't need it. If we want to do infrastructure investment or have an NHS, we don't need money from arms sales to do it. I think MMT is here to help.
But it just shows the decision is political, right? So Andrew also mentions that, that there is an argument to say that the pandemic has shown that protecting against pandemics, wars, international institutions like the IMF, maintaining food and energy independence for at least some degree, these things are important. And I agree they're important. Those are strategic decisions that you make to protect your nation from external factors that you really have little control of. It's not just you falling out of favor with the European Union or the potential for war between nations, but also there are many other crises that could happen externally that could affect your supply of goods if you entirely depend on that. If you don't have the skills in your country to produce these things because you have let your industries die basically for a long time, then you are far more vulnerable to that, and that can cause real problems.
Yeah. So I just come back to the point that MMT is not going, just import everything. There's no need to have skills. Yeah. There's no need to, it's not doing, because imports are a real benefit and exports are a real cost. So we just import everything.
Yeah. But, if you think about it, countries like the UK and the US somehow through their, call it, economic growth or whatever, somehow have managed to put themselves in a position where they are taking more from the outside world than they are giving back in terms of production, right? And which means that at the moment, at least, they are benefiting from this additional input into their economies. Yeah. People in their countries are enjoying the goods from abroad. And how did they manage to do that? How did they manage to get in a position where they are able to do that for a sustained amount of time?
Yeah. And colonialism probably has something to do with it.
Yeah, it probably does. Thing. And I would imagine that as other nations grow as well and develop their economies, that disparity will be less pronounced, probably.
I think in our last sort of conversation we had like this, Patricia, I mentioned Ha-Joon Chang's 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. He talks about liberalization of markets is not what made economies like the US and the UK strong. They were highly protectionist at a certain point. If they'd applied neoliberal rules to their economies as they were developing, they would be basket cases by now. And obviously we now recommend neoliberal rules for everybody else while they're trying to develop. And it's classic kicking the ladder away stuff, isn't it? Yeah. So that they can maintain this advantage that they have in the world. The MMT economists themselves have their opinions about these kind of things, but I always just bring it back to the point of, when it comes to international trade and ethics and stuff like that, I think MMT can really help activists. That's my point of view.
Yeah, certainly the big countries, kind of the developed world forces policies on the developing world that they didn't follow themselves.
Yeah, which is kind of where Fidel Kaboub and others' work comes into its own. So that was that. If you'd like to hear the full Q&A episode and participate in next month's Q&A episode, go to patreon.com/MMT podcast. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.